Welcome back to the 2015 FPI Forum, the Strength to Lead. It's a true honor this afternoon to be joined by President Toomas Hendrik Ilves of the Republic of Estonia for a discussion about the future of Europe, titled A Europe Whole and Free. The theme of today's panel, of course, is drawn from a speech delivered in 1989 by President George H.W. Bush, in which he declared that the West had remained, quote, faithful to our values and our vision, end quote, and because of that, the people of Eastern Europe now had the opportunity to be whole and free alongside their neighbors. Estonia has realized the potential of those values and that vision. It is today a member of the European Union, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and a model of prosperity and freedom. President Ilves has helped to guide this transition. He served as Estonia's ambassador to the United States from 1993 to 1996, and then as Minister of Foreign Affairs almost continuously from 1996 to 2002. After serving in the Estonian and European parliaments, he was elected as the fourth president of Estonia in 2006 and re-elected in 2011. He has long promoted Estonia's information and technological development, helping it to make his country one of the most wired in the world. He writes and speaks extensively on transatlantic relations, e-government, and cybersecurity, among other topics, and we're very fortunate to be able to benefit from his insights today. Moderating the conversation will be FPI's own James Kirchick, who is a fellow at the Foreign Policy Initiative. As a journalist, Jamie has reported from Southern and North Africa, the Middle East, the Caucasus, Central Asia, and pretty much all of Europe. He is currently writing a book in which he'll assess the myriad challenges Europe is facing, and welcome him to come on stage and ask you to join me in thanking the President for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Mr. President, thank you for joining us. In preparation for our conversation today, I went back and I read many of the speeches and talks that you've given over the past couple of years. And you mention quite often the United Nations Charter, the Helsinki Final Act, the Paris Charter, the Budapest Memorandum, almost every time you speak. Can you please explain to us why these agreements are important? And do you think that they are being enforced?
Well, they're important to, the first three are important because they basically are the treaties, ratified treaties, where the transatlantic space has obligated itself to follow certain principles that in fact worked. Inviolability of borders, no border changes through use of force, free choice for countries to on their associations, alliances, and so forth. And, well, they don't work. That's the problem. I mean, if we've all agreed that, you can't go around invading countries, at least people like me, I'm old enough to actually believe all that. So when you see this being violated, or these principles being violated, then the question is, what is it that underlies transatlantic security? If you think about, it wasn't simply, it wasn't eroded in February of 2014 with the Anschluss of, which is the right term, the Anschluss of Crimea, but in fact already in 2007 with the changes in the borders of Georgia in the Russia-Georgia war, in which then in January of 2008, at that time, then President Medvedev and also then Prime Minister Putin each made a statement saying, well, the real reason for the Georgia war was to prevent them from joining NATO. I mean, that should have set off alarm bells, but at the time we were all trying to have a strategic partnership with them in Europe and so on. So here we are facing a world in which those agreements that we thought, especially in the post-Cold War era, would be the foundation of peace and security don't seem to work. And of course, on top of that, you do have the Budapest Memorandum, which is not ratified as a memorandum, but in it, the United States, the UK, and the Russian Federation agreed to maintain the territorial integrity of Ukraine in return for Ukraine giving up what at the time was the third largest nuclear weapons cache in the world. The irony of it is that, well, the Ukrainians gave it up. They got this guarantee of territorial integrity. And where the irony is, at least according to the statements made by the Russian Federation, the Crimea now has nuclear weapons in it. So not only have we given up on the territorial integrity of Ukraine that was guaranteed by two countries in the West, at least, but now there are nuclear weapons on the territory of what remains Ukraine, even though someone else claims it. And so given that situation, I think we have to reassess what security is about. Today, we had this, there was this, Richard Lugar and some other people about 20 years ago wrote an article in Foreign Affairs saying out of area or out of business. And this was kind of a mantra taken over also by many other by think tanks. I mean, they said, okay, Europe, fine, okay, that's done with. That it was all just all that was left after 1991 was basically a mop-up operation, meaning you get, well, we take the ones who are good enough into NATO and the European Union, and eventually the other ones will follow as well. They may be a little slower. But this is a mop-up operation. The real issues are the wider Middle East, Pacific, China, and that everything was okay. Well, as it turned out, it's not. And I think what we have to do now is reassess the situation and see what are we going to do now. Where are we going? Certainly, I think in our neck of the woods, the role of the United States remains crucial, meaning sort of in Northern Europe. I think also that I would say the two-front challenge we face in Europe today, both from the refugee crisis, which has now completely swamped all news about Ukraine, and then, of course, the Eastern problem in Ukraine, which is not only Ukraine, but extremely belligerent behavior in our part of the world where the Russians fly transponderless military jets in international airspace in civil aviation corridors. The thing being that civil aviation they're not AWACS planes. They can't see what's going around. They have to rely on military planes or all planes having transponders, which just say beep, 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 we're here, we're not going to crash. And in fact, when you have one country flying planes without transponders, it's only a matter of time before we have a disaster, and we've had a few near misses narrowly averted. A civilian airliner sort of within, 100 meters or yards of a military jet. I mean, these are, this is a matter of fractions of seconds that we've avoided one disaster. I mean, there's this behavior all around that should make us reassess our previous assumptions about how whole, free, and at peace we are.
So on that subject, your country's territorial integrity, one could argue, was violated a year ago when Eston Kover, who was an agent in your
The FBI,
analogous to your FBI, was essentially kidnapped from Estonian territory by FSB agents and absconded to Moscow. And this happened 2 days after President Obama himself gave a speech in Tallinn where he pledged commitment to Article 5. Seems to me like this was quite a slap in the face, not only to Estonia, but to to NATO as well. And then in a scene out of the Cold War this past weekend, he was exchanged, and we're all relieved, obviously, that he's now home. He was exchanged for a Russian spy that you had. Can you please describe maybe the events leading up to this, to the extent that you can? And do you think Russia succeeded? Do you think Russia succeeded? Did they win, basically, by kidnapping a citizen of your country and getting a spy back out of it?
Well, to be honest, we didn't look upon her. Sort of, it's not like a.
He's not a spy, obviously. But
He's not a spy. I mean, he was investigating.
Yes,
he was
right.
investigating a massive smuggling operation, and the only thing I can deduce from that is that it must have reached up fairly high. If it was a military action, that really. It was a military action to abduct him, and the fact that that very night he was already in Lefortovo prison in Moscow shows that someone was irked by Estonians looking at a cigarette smuggling operation. Well, I mean, for us, I mean, as a president and as a citizen of my country, I mean, it's you want your guy back.
Of course.
You want your citizen home, and that's all that matters. And I'm sure any person in the United States or any other country where has been in a similar situation, your only concern really is your own person. But on the other hand, I mean, it's I don't know. I mean, we got a few more in jail, so it's okay. We're very good at it.
Yes, right. You have several,
Capturing
right?
them.
With what's happening now in Syria, do you think we're going to start hearing European leaders come out and maybe extend their hands to President Putin in joining his anti-ISIS coalition? Do you think that people will go along with his explanations for what the Russians are now doing in Syria? And if that is the case, what repercussions do you think his behavior in Syria may have on Ukraine?
Well, to start with, I raised my eyebrows when I saw as opposed to the narrative I gave of sort of the UN, OSCE, and so forth. He started his speech at the UN that the cornerstone of European security was laid at the Yalta Conference, which, if you're from Eastern Europe, you just think Yalta does not really strike most people as being one of the great single achievements of the 20th century. In fact, it led to the division of Europe. But I mean, I think that's a strong signal as well. Spheres of influence, all of those kinds of old.
He also justified the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact recently as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of that. I mean, so. Well, the problem is that Europe will not use force to. I mean, it's just not possible for Europe to use force in the Middle East. And so that basically leaves Europe in a position of, well, we're not going to do it. There's who else is going to do it? Basically, it's the United States or Russia. So Europe is on the sidelines, and in that regard, on the other hand, without having a policy or being hampered from doing anything because of one or another objection, we end up simply taking in lots of refugees, which I personally don't think is the best way of. I mean, we're taking in refugees, that's perfectly fine, but I think that if you not having a policy of to address the source of the problem, we're going to be taking in more and more refugees. Clearly, I think there's a frustration in Europe that, once again, it's the Americans and it's the Russians are doing something, and this. There may be some temptations to say, well, good that they're going in there and doing it for us, but we will certainly do everything to keep that from turning into the kind of bargain of you go after Daesh, we give up on Crimea. I mean, I think that kind of I mean, in some sense, that's the implicit offer being made, but we cannot accept the annexation, incorporation of territory. I mean, basically a repeat of what we saw in Austria in 1938 or in the Baltic countries in 1940. But that's something we'll have to face now. On the third hand, I mean, to sprout all of these appendages. On the fourth hand, I don't know, we have at least the initial bombing that took place yesterday was against neither al-Nusra or ISIS, Daesh. It was in Homs. I was against the non-terrorist opponents of the Assad regime. So we're kind of lost. I mean, what exactly is happening here? We do know that the Russians are allies of Assad. But this idea of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, or I'm not sure how it works in this logic, but if we see them not going after Daesh or ISIL or ISIS or whatever you want to call it, then what are they doing?
Somewhat related to this is obviously, as you mentioned, is the migrant crisis, and some of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, and I'm not including the Baltics in this, but namely the Czech Republic, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, the V4 countries. There's been a real resistance towards welcoming refugees. Could you give us a bit of a Baltic perspective on this crisis?
Well, okay,
or an
I only talk about
Estonian
it.
perspective, excuse me.
I really cannot talk about other countries. Well, my position, which I've iterated and reiterated and reiterated, is that if we're going to be dependent upon and requesting solidarity from our NATO allies in this regard, then when our NATO or EU allies require assistance on another front, then we really don't have much of a moral claim to ask from one and not provide the other. And, well, that's basically my position. And Estonia is taking refugees, and we're taking basically the amount that the European Union asked us to take. It's just what we're doing. But there is that resistance, and in some other countries, we see governments being opposed. I really can't comment on that, but I guess that's what they're like.
On the issue of NATO solidarity, there's a new leader of the Labour Party in the United Kingdom who has said openly that it was wrong for NATO to accept Poland and several other countries of Central and Eastern Europe into the alliance, and by implication, I can only assume he probably has the same feelings towards your own countries.
Yeah,
are you worried about the issue of NATO solidarity, or is this a fringe? Is this just a fringe movement?
Well, I mean, people can have opinions about what happened 20 years ago, whether they like it or not, but I mean, we have a treaty, and the treaty works, so I'm not sure what we can do about that. No, well, the point is that NATO solidarity hinges upon itself. That is, were it to fail, then NATO fails. I mean, how would NATO solidarity fail? I mean, someone would say at the North Atlantic Council, no, we don't think we should go help that country. At that point, Article 5 ceases to exist, and from that point on, everybody's on their own. And about the only country that can continue on its own is the United States. And the rest of the countries in NATO will be without Article 5, and there will be no NATO. So that's pretty strong incentive to keep it going, because it's not possible to say, okay, country X says, no, we're going to veto Article 5. Well, no, what's going to happen to that country afterwards? So it's fairly strong. Where the solidarity is weak is, as you know, is with defense expenditure. I mean, we are one of the very, very few countries in Europe that actually fulfills the requirement to devote 2% of your GDP to defense. and we've been doing this. Other countries have not and are spending less and less, even though there are commitments to raise defense expenditures from the Wales summit. Well, we'll see. I mean, it's Wales. Wales was kind of the reassurance summit. I think, I mean, it's a good term, but reassurance is kind of like calming down those poor little East Europeans, whereas I think the real thing that we're concerned about is deterrence, not reassurance. It's not us. I mean, we don't have to feel good. Someone else that has to feel that we better not do anything. So that's the deterrence side. We do need to look at long-term solutions, because really what came out of Wales were short-term. And we need to, well, recognizing that we are back in area to be back in business, that we need to be ready for strategic surprises.
One of those countries that doesn't spend 2% is Germany, which spends, I believe, about 1.3%. And I've lived in Germany, and I know you speak the German language and have fond feelings for Germany. And are you concerned about a return of neutralist sentiment in Germany? This was something that was a big concern in the 80s with the Euro missiles debate and whatnot. Do you see, I mean, obviously Chancellor Merkel's been quite strong on Ukraine, but after her, what does the future hold for Germany and transatlanticism?
Well, first of all, we do admit that basically if there is any unity in Europe on issues such as Ukraine, sanctions, it's maintained by the leadership of Angela Merkel. And so I'm not, that's not always so understood when I read the US press, that basically without her sort of pushing things, Europe would be a lot less coherent and cohesive. And I really couldn't contemplate life after Merkel. But in fact, it is, Germany, it's the biggest economy in Europe, it's the biggest country in Europe. That does bring special responsibilities that for many years it didn't want to take, but it's been kind of forced upon it with the financial crisis, now with Ukraine. The need for Germany to play a large role is not just contingent upon Angela Merkel.
Right, and I think one of the areas where there's been some disagreement is your country and the other Baltic countries and Poland have pushed for at least a larger troop presence, NATO troop presence in the east, if not permanent bases. And that has met with a lot of resistance in Western Europe. Could you explain your perspective on this and why you think it's necessary to really fulfill the deterrent effect of NATO?
Well, deterrence is that no one gets any smart ideas or any dumb ideas. I think there is this residual desire, let's not rock the boat too much, but it is funny to hear that from countries that themselves have tens of thousands of U.S. troops permanently.
Which will go unnamed.
As I said, our goal is deterrence. It's not measured in how many boots you have on the ground, but what is important is the effect. That if something happens, and if we invade a country or do something, this will be met with a proportional and adequate response. That's known as deterrence. We think that deterrence is better served with pre-positioning of equipment, with more troops. The modalities, I think, we can discuss and should discuss. But at the same time, we think that it's kind of odd to hear from some countries that enjoy a huge troop presence that no, you shouldn't be able to do that because it might be provocative. Well, what's the point of them having troops at all? Why are they there?
Those measures, those are that's conventional deterrence. How do we prepare for unconventional attacks, cyber attacks, which your country has experienced, obviously, and other potential little green men, who knows?
Well, one of the things I would dispute here, and which I do constantly, is that, it may sound sexy, but, hybrid war is not a new concept. General Gerasimov wrote an article in Voenny Promyshlenny Courier, it's a Russian journal, in February of 2013, talking about something called hybrid war, in which you do this, that. But if you actually look at wars as they have been pursued, in our own case, say, an attempted coup in 1924 with little green men and troops right off our borders and ships right off our borders and seizing the telegraph at that time. The communications equivalent of
Twitter.
Also of your internet.
Right.
Hybrid war. It's a new label for something we have seen repeatedly. You can say that most of the takeovers of Poland, Hungary, then Czechoslovakia, Eastern Europe in the post-war era, 45 to 48, also were hybrid. You had NKVD troops, you had local people who were paid off, and all kinds of nasty things were done, and rigged elections. All of those things took place. No one called it a hybrid war then, or a hybrid coup or anything, but that's the same mechanisms. So we don't have to have too many conferences on the new hybrid war. It's kind of like the old hybrid war, it just wasn't called a hybrid war. Clearly, what is a new element is the use of computer technology. New technologies that are incorporated into warfare always, and often the first first thing that's incorporated are new technologies just into wars or fighting. And we have to develop counter strategies, and we have, and lots of other countries have. What is a little different is the massive use of propaganda and kind of the sort of Baudrillard and Derrida postmodernist approach to there is no truth. You can lie as much as you want. That's new, and we have to grapple with that intellectually. And so, I would say that people who've been studying Baudrillard and Derrida should figure out a way of how you defend the West with Baudrillard and Derrida.
Would you say that the messaging coming out of the Kremlin over the past 2 years, we could say year and a half since Crimea, has it been, how would you rate its success in sort of penetrating Western discourse? Have they failed miserably? Have they made some inroads in convincing people of the rightness of their cause?
It's provided, if you take the broader message, actually, it's a very retrograde and ultimately very divisive message, which is kind of very nationalist, sort of anti-liberal. I would say it's kind of like the counter-enlightenment. When you see the Russian sort of leadership and press referring to gay Europa, because Europe tends to be fairly liberal on these issues, I would say faux appeal to traditional religious values. And then, of course, on top of that, bankrolling all kinds of hardcore, very extremist right-wing organizations and parties in Europe. It is an anti-European feeling, anti-American feeling. You see across Europe a number of what you would call sort of really extreme right-wing parties, and some extreme left-wing parties as well, who have the same message, which is that Russia good, America bad, Europe bad, gays bad. That's working. On the other hand, if you look at the Pew study of attitudes towards Russia across the countries that are studied there, I mean, you'd say it's been a miserable failure. That 2.5, 3 years ago, there was an overwhelming majority of Germans had a favorable opinion of Russia. Today, a very small number of Germans have a favorable opinion. So, I mean, it is effective in dividing Europe. It has been tremendously ineffective as in a positive way. I mean, soft power in the sort of Joseph Nye sense, it is failing, but soft power in the sense of bribing people and getting people angry and being nasty, they're successful.
I think we'll open it up for questions at this point. There's maybe microphones rolling around, and I will choose you, and if you could identify yourself, and please make it a question, not a statement. This isn't the United Nations General Assembly.
Even their time is limited.
And even their time is limited, absolutely. The lady here in the front, thank you.
Hi, Jordan Slopey, NATO Special Operations Headquarters. My question is, what role do you see NATO taking on and furthering with Ukraine, Georgia, countering Russian aggression, and the IO campaign? Well, that's a loaded question, but what more can they do? What more should they do?
Well, I mean, given that there's little political will to actually arm Ukraine, then the next best thing is to train Ukrainians. Training the military, assisting them develop different branches of, or different types of, military training. I mean, from special operations to cyber, counter cyber. I mean, a lot of things that can be done. And so if lacking the political will to do more, then at least training is fairly minimal. I mean, it's a fairly sort of minor thing to do, but that's what we can do.
Is there potential for bilateral arms shipments on a bilateral basis to Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, that's possible.
I believe, is Lithuania maybe the only country that's done it, or is, I mean, do you see further movement on that if Washington?
Well,
You don't have to go there. That's okay. The gentleman in the back.
Thank you. I'm Leon Weintraub, Foreign Service retired. I'd like to ask you, sir, if you can discuss with us the nature of the information or intelligence concerning in Ukraine the missile that shot down the civilian aircraft, and if in fact it was from the separatist area, the nature of the intelligence concerning the influence of Russian command and control over that incident.
Well, if you follow Bellingcat.com, which is an open source, strictly open source investigative online, I don't know what you call it. I mean, it's kind of, just a bunch of people who as freelance journalists have tracked the entire path. Clearly, the Buk missile launcher is something which they did not have them, and Ukrainians didn't have it. We followed the trajectory of of how its path through Russia to Ukraine. It's a very sophisticated sort of piece of machinery that requires long-term training, which was not offered by the Ukrainians. So it's kind of like, I think it's kind of a no-brainer. I don't know what else to say. I mean, I guess the additional bit of information is lack of cooperation in the investigation that was led by the Dutch, and the refusal of the Russian Federation in the UN to actually hold an investigation. And it all kinds of adds up.
When this incident happened, I remember everyone at the time saying, now Putin's really done it, now he's crossed that line, this is the end of it. And yet it was just a month later is when he really inserted troops officially into Ukraine on the eastern border. I mean, what would it take, do you think, to really get the rest of Europe, outraged about this, to the point where they're inflicting the sort of sanctions, perhaps sending weapons to the Ukrainians, taking the steps that you think?
I don't know. I mean, I would say that given where we are today, I would have expected a far tougher response. I mean, precisely because all the things we've been, that at least I grew up with people paying lip service to as being the most important documents and so forth, when they are violated, and then you have all kinds of voices saying, oh, well, let's, kiss and make up, and, too bad. But, so I don't know. I mean, the will to appease is fairly strong, and not only in Europe. I mean, there are even people in your own parliament.
Yes, there are. The lady in the back at the desk, at the press table.
Thank you. Leandra Bernstein, Sputnik International News. At the UN General Assembly, there was a lot of talk about the international coalition to fight against the Islamic State. And it would seem that the disagreement between the United States, some other countries in the West, and Russia on how to approach the Islamic State in Syria is just prolonging the conflict. So how do you approach these Russian strikes in terms of potentially cooperating, or is that completely out of the picture?
You're from Sputnik, yes? You are bombing the wrong people. Civilians, not ISIL, not Daesh. Period.
Yeah, I think that puts it well. The gentleman over here.
Hi, Mirko Vossen from the Young Transatlantic Initiative from Germany.
Thank you.
I have a question concerning the Greek crisis. Could you maybe comment on that? Because I personally believe we are not through. And maybe on the conflict of showing European solidarity and at the same time the reluctance to give in to this special Greek government.
Well, we feel pretty good about this because we've been, in general, our behavior domestically is more German than German, with a 10% indebtedness, 10% GDP, and a budget surplus. And when I pushed through the parliament, both EF, SF, and ESM, Estonia's average salary was 10% below the minimum salary in Greece, and the retirement age in Estonia was 63 for civil servants, and the retirement age for Greek civil servants was 50. So, as you can imagine, this was not very popular among Estonians to have a poor country bail out a richer country, but we did it, and twice. But we do believe very strongly in fiscal responsibility.
Your country was hit by the financial crisis and had to go
Yes.
undergo some difficult austerity measures.
20% cuts.
Could you talk about Estonia's recovery and the policies that it took to come back to growth, and what lessons you might be able to impart to your Greek comrades?
Well, cut early. The earlier you cut, the less you have to cut, and the longer you delay it, the more painful it will be. And our recovery proceeded within a year and a half, 2 years. We were well on our way back, and we're doing quite well now. So I would say do it. But, having been at the receiving end of advice for so many years, I'm loath to give other countries advice.
It's something we can all learn from. This gentleman here. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Russell King, retired federal employee. I have a question about Article 5. Now, I believe the only time Article 5 actually went into effect was Operation Enduring Freedom, where NATO countries joined as a result of an asymmetric attack against the United States. And of course, the Malaysia airline would also be an asymmetric attack. I understand there have been cyber attacks and so forth. Has there been times when particularly countries of NATO have considered something an Article 5 offense and differed with other NATO members about whether it is or not and whether action should be taken?
Well, in general, no. I mean, there have been Article 4 consultations, which you have consultations before you move on to the next stage. But in general, Article 5 is one of those things where you go for it. I mean, you're going to go for it when you feel like you need it, and then the whole organization basically doesn't turn into a debating shop. It's clear. I mean, as it was in the case of 9/11, it was clear. I would say as a side commentary, I would also, I wrote about this about 12 years ago, I would be careful about the term asymmetric warfare. That's not a new form of thing. As you know, the U.S. Revolutionary War, Boston Commons, or Lexington, you had, what really bothered the Brits was that they were marching in formation and their redcoats and all these funny people were behind trees in their regular clothes, and that was pretty hybrid. Pretty rather asymmetric, because the Americans were not lining up in rows with their blue uniforms. So warfare has a lot less new under the sun. It's just we give them new terms all the time. So about 10, 12 years ago, we were constantly reading about asymmetric warfare. Well, we've seen asymmetric warfare throughout history.
On the question of Article 5, there was a Pew poll over the summer that showed majorities, I believe, in Germany, France, and Italy, expressing the belief that their country should not militarily defend a fellow NATO member if they're invaded.
Yeah, but they also, a vast, overwhelming majority thought the United States should aid them if they were attacked.
Right, so there's a real hypocrisy here. One, how important are these poll findings? Are they really not that important, or are they? And if they are of consequence, how do leaders communicate the importance of this to their populations?
Well, since most leaders know that if they don't fulfill their NATO obligations when it's required, that getting reelected is not going to be their major concern anymore. So leaders know there is a treaty obligation. There are a lot of treaty obligations that perhaps may not be so popular, but they fulfill them, knowing full well that, as I said, your biggest problem is not going to be reelected next time if you destroy NATO.
Right. Other questions? Sir.
Thank you, Mr. President, for such informative presentation. My name is Nikolai Vorobyev. I'm Ukrainian journalist, political and partly military journalist, so every once in a while I travel to the battle zone and writing for the Center for Eastern European Perspectives. So I just have a short remark and then afterward two short questions. The first is about the training in Eastern Ukraine. So it's a bit joint training with the Western allies. It's a big question who is a trainer in this situation, because I interviewed few Ukrainian generals, and they said that our allies ask us to teach how to fight in hybrid war and how to fight Russians, because they don't have this experience. So this is a good advantage probably which even our Ukrainian forces could contribute to NATO, because they never faced Russian on the battlefields. Two questions about, the first question about Putin's speech in General Assembly. So how do you evaluate it generally? Could they lead anti-ISIS coalition? And what will be the Western response on their airstrikes? The second question about the upcoming summit tomorrow within four parties, four countries of France, Germany, Ukraine, and Russia. So what do you expect? Is it possible the lifting of the sanctions in case if Russians will only remain ceasefire without full implementation of Minsk Memorandum? Thank you very much.
Well, sanctions are not only contingent upon fulfilling Minsk, it's also the annexation of Crimea that, in fact, was the initial cause of the sanctions. The Minsk agreement are about their continued activities in the Donbass. And lifting sanctions is not something that will be decided on the part of Europe because of two countries saying it has to be done. I doubt that. And sanctions also are in place from the United States and Canada, so I'm not that worried. What was the first question?
About Putin's speech in General Assembly. So how do we avoid it?
Well, I mean, as I said, so far, all that's come out of in this anti-Daesh thing is bombing the wrong people in homes. So we'll see. I mean, it's too early to tell. I mean, I feel like, we're like 3 days after the occupation of Crimea. I mean, no one knew what was going on. It all happened so fast. Right now, we're 3 days after a speech. We know there have been bombings. We know they're not bombing the people we thought they would be bombing, and I think we still have the very large unresolved issue of Assad, who is a declared ally of Russia, and for the rest of us, is someone we really don't want to see in power as a person who uses barrel bombs against his own civilians. So it's going to be a tough sell, I'd say.
Yes, right over here. Thank you.
Thank you, Herr President. Patrick Muldray from the 2015 class of FPI Future Leaders. In my recent think tank work, I've been focusing on Russian cyber espionage. I'm wondering if you would be willing to talk a little bit about the threat that cybersecurity poses to a Europe whole and free. Thank you.
Well, I mean, it's cyber. I mean, I think the biggest threat to European security in the cyber domain comes from an unwillingness of most countries actually to take adequate measures to prevent cyber espionage. That is to say, I don't get into too long a discussion. This is my favorite topic, but basically, as long as you have the level of security that you currently see in most countries and most governments, is going to keep happening. Past summer's theft of the Office of Personnel Management's data on all federal employees, including, sort of personality evaluations. I read the other day 5.6 million sets of fingerprints. I mean, you're not going to be able to use, even if you want to do two-factor identification, which is a sine qua non, forget using fingerprints. So I think that the first step is actually to start hardening systems. Second thing that must be done is to get the kind of cooperation within NATO that we see on, say, interoperability of say, U.S. missiles under French Mirage jets. I mean, that's interoperability. When it comes to cyber, it's much more in the kind of intelligence domain where nations don't really want to share too much. If we don't get over that, we'll be in trouble. A third thing that really needs to be done is far closer private-public cooperation, because it's not just the federal employee records. Thereafter is also intellectual property. Companies spend years and billions on R&D, and then it gets sucked out in like a matter of a weekend because of poor cybersecurity, which basically, it impoverishes nations. So, I think what we really do need is a broader approach to cyber security on our own sort of side of making things safer. And that's not something that's simply a matter of government offices or just the military. it's an overall approach to how we deal with computers. First of all, there was we've all probably seen the classic 1993 New Yorker cartoon with two dogs, one in front of a computer saying to the other dog, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. Well, that's the problem, is that with the current level of identification that required, just one password that can be hacked with ease, that's silly. And the refusal in many countries to have any kind of more secure national identity system means that what Vice President Al Gore called the information highway is superhighway. Well, think of it then as a billion-lane road full of cars, and none of them has a license plate. That's where we are.
I think we have time maybe for one more question, or do we have more time, or maybe two? Okay, so this young lady over here.
Thank you, Mr. President. My name's Meredith Hiles. I'm with the British Embassy, and I would like to comment that it's typically associated that Russia is coming into the Eastern European geopolitical situation with a very Cold War mindset. Would you say that Western Europe, as well as the United States, are coming in with a similar mindset, and would you say that this mindset is advisable or accurate for the situation?
Well, I wouldn't say Russia's coming in with a Cold War mindset. And I think the Cold War is unjustly denigrated. Because I say this as a former troglodyte Cold Warrior, having worked for Radio Free Europe for 10 years. But let's keep in mind, during the Cold War, we didn't have a hot war. We didn't have people being killed. We didn't have planes being shot down in Europe. There were all kinds of nasty things going around elsewhere, but the Cold War, from a European perspective, as awful and nasty as it was, and it was awful and nasty, and my relatives were living behind the barbed wire. My father didn't get to see his brother. There's all this stuff that was terrible. But the point is, people were not being killed. Or at least they're being killed, yes, trying to cross that obscene thing known as the Berlin Wall. But are we approaching it with the Cold War mentality? I think oftentimes we're approaching it with a Neville Chamberlain mentality, but not a Cold War mentality.
And one more question, the gentleman over here, thank you.
Mr. President, I'm going to move a little bit from politics, but I wanted to talk more of how is the oil prices affecting the shale oil in Estonia?
Well, it's hard. It costs money to make shale oil, so if the price of oil goes down, then it's not always necessarily good for the shale oil business. But I think the low price of oil is, in general, working in the favor of a Europe whole, free, and at peace.
Let's hope it stays that way. Mr. President, thank you for your time. It was delightful to have you, and safe journey back home.